Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. What happens when a hurricane isn't the deadliest threat in town? On August 25, 2017, hours before Harvey hit Texas, Crystal McDowell disappeared. No note, no phone calls, just an empty space where a mother should have been. Crystal Surratt McDowell was 37 years old. A real estate agent in Baytown, Texas, she was well known for her resilience and professionalism. Recently divorced, she was navigating life as a single mother of two. Friends described her as upbeat and driven, always trying to balance career obligations with parenting responsibilities. In her private life, she had begun seeing someone new, but she still maintained frequent contact with her ex-husband because of their children. On the morning of August 25th, Baytown was bracing for one of the most destructive hurricanes in recent memory. The weather had already grown tense. Families were boarding windows, stocking supplies, and preparing to evacuate. Against that backdrop of looming chaos, Crystal's disappearance did not register immediately as suspicious. At first, it seemed possible she had been delayed, stranded, or forced to change plans because of the storm. But within hours, the silence around her movements became impossible to ignore. According to security footage, Crystal left her boyfriend, Paul Hargrave's home just before 7:35 a.m. that Friday morning. She was driving her black Mercedes. The footage shows her car pulling away from the driveway and heading toward the main road. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. By late morning, messages to her phone went unanswered. Colleagues at her real estate office noticed her absence. She had scheduled appointments, showings, and client meetings that day, commitments she had never missed before. A missing showing, in the real estate business, is as conspicuous as a missed surgery appointment for a doctor. It simply wasn't like her. Within minutes of noticing her silence, family members and close friends began calling repeatedly. There was no voicemail, no outgoing texts, no explanation. By early afternoon, her family placed a 911 call reporting her missing. Deputies from Chambers County were dispatched. Their first assessment was practical. With Harvey barreling toward the Gulf Coast, any number of emergencies might have interrupted her plans. Roads were flooding. Power lines were expected to collapse. Storm conditions had already triggered minor evacuations. Still, the deputies noted inconsistencies. Her car had not been seen on major evacuation routes. No alerts came from state troopers about a vehicle stranded. Neighbors had not reported unusual activity. For investigators trained in missing person protocol, the absence of routine signals was itself an anomaly. The timeline began to harden. 7:35 a.m. Crystal leaves her boyfriend's home, driving alone. 12 o'clock p.m. Calls and texts unanswered, no contact with clients. 1 o'clock p.m. Family members attempt repeated outreach. Early afternoon. Missing person call to 911. When deputies arrived to speak with her family, the questions were precise. Had she left a note? Did she call anyone to report a change of plans? Was there evidence she had planned to evacuate with her children? Each answer narrowed the possibilities. No note, no phone calls. Her children were not with her. The storm gave investigators a ready-made explanation for delay, but silence this complete, both digital and physical, was inconsistent with Harvey's chaos. Even in disaster zones, phones usually ping cell towers, or friends hear about last-minute movements. Here, nothing. Investigators recognize what law enforcement manuals call quiet anomalies. Crystal's family emphasized her routine habits. She always kept contact, especially when her children were concerned. She had prepared storm supplies, but she had not told anyone she planned to leave town that morning. The picture forming was not of a woman overwhelmed by a hurricane, but of someone whose movements had abruptly ended. The first response by deputies involved checking local hospitals, shelters, and evacuation routes. None had a record of her name or her vehicle. Early canvassing around Baytown produced no witnesses who had seen her car after she left Paul Hargrave's home. Investigators knew that in missing person cases, the first 48 hours were critical. Storm or not, they would need to widen the search. Still, official communication remained cautious. On paper, the case was a missing person report filed hours before a Category 4 storm. But privately, detectives noted the gaps. Missing because of a storm and missing without a trace were very different scenarios. One allowed for recovery, the other implied foul play. By the evening of August 25th, law enforcement began to log her case more carefully. They documented last known location, identified potential routes, and secured the footage from Paul Hargrave's home. The first steps in any procedural crime investigation had begun, even if the word crime had not yet been formally applied. For the community, Harvey's arrival dominated headlines. But for investigators in Chambers County, the storm only complicated the effort to locate Crystal McDowell. It made travel harder, delayed tips, and blurred the distinction between disaster victims and potential homicide victims. Yet, in the silence of her phone and the absence of her car, there were already signals that this case would not resolve as a storm-related disappearance. The deputies prepared to escalate. That escalation would begin with the most tangible lead available, the black Mercedes she drove away in that morning. The search for Crystal McDowell had already collided with Hurricane Harvey, but investigators knew that weather could not explain everything. Days after she was last seen, her case shifted from a missing person file to a homicide investigation. That change was not made in public statements immediately, but inside the morgue, the facts spoke for themselves. At the Chambers County Medical Examiner's Office, forensic staff followed strict procedure. The transfer of remains from the recovery site to the lab was logged minute by minute. Personal effects, clothing, jewelry, a wristwatch, were sealed in evidence bags. Each item received a barcode, matched against chain of custody forms. That paperwork mattered. In trials, defense attorneys often look for even minor breaks in handling to claim contamination or misidentification. Here, every link in the chain had to hold. The autopsy began less than 24 hours after recovery. The examiner's notes were clinical. Female, 37, consistent with the identification already provided by family. The cause of death was confirmed as strangulation. There were no indications of drowning, no high levels of alcohol or drugs in her system. This finding eliminated the possibility that Crystal had been another casualty of Harvey's flooding. The storm could no longer serve as cover for her disappearance. Forensic photographs documented the condition of the body before and after examination. Measurements of ligature impressions around the neck were taken, but no rope or cord was recovered at the scene. That absence was as significant as the markings themselves. It suggested removal or concealment. Investigators understood this detail as more than biology. It was behavioral evidence. Someone had wanted to control not just Crystal, but the narrative of what happened to her. Negative evidence carried equal weight. Toxicology tests returned clean, no sedatives, no recreational drugs. Preliminary blood panels aligned with a healthy adult female. That meant she was not incapacitated chemically before her death. Whoever committed this crime had used direct force. Detectives attended the autopsy, taking notes as the examiner described findings. They asked questions quietly, careful not to disrupt the process. Was there evidence of sexual assault? Any defensive wounds? The answers were precise. No indications of sexual assault, no classic cuts or bruises on the hands. The absence of those features suggested that Crystal may have been restrained or overpowered quickly. For investigators, such details narrowed scenarios. They could rule out some motives and strengthen others. The examiner signed the official death certificate with the line, cause of death, strangulation, manner of death, homicide. From that point forward, the case legally crossed from missing person into murder investigation. For law enforcement, the morgue was not just a site of science, but a turning point. The storm had allowed speculation. Maybe she was swept away. Maybe she sought shelter elsewhere. Those explanations ended here. With homicide certified, detectives could frame questions differently in interviews. They were no longer looking for someone lost. They were looking for someone who killed. Chain of custody extended beyond the body itself. Crystal's clothing was tested for trace fibers. Her jewelry was photographed to confirm it matched descriptions given by her children and family members. Even the watch she wore was inspected for broken glass or signs of struggle. Each item was cataloged, entered into evidence, and secured for potential presentation in court. Inside the department, briefing notes circulated. Investigators highlighted the precision of the strangulation marks. It was not consistent with a random assault or accident. This was close contact homicide, a form often linked to personal relationships. Statistically, cases like this tend to circle back to partners, former partners, or family members. Still, procedure required them to test every possible angle. Detectives discussed the implications. The car had been located separately, staged in a parking lot. The body was recovered in woods. That separation suggested planning. Whoever committed the crime had attempted to misdirect investigators, splitting vehicle and victim into different geographies. Forensic science told them how she died. Behavioral analysis hinted at why locations had been chosen. One detective later reflected, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. He was referring to the odd neatness. A vehicle abandoned intact, a body recovered without accompanying weapon, no digital signals after a certain hour. Clean lines in an investigation can be signs of staging, not randomness. For viewers, this is a moment to pause. In towns across America, a hurricane can take lives, but homicide leaves different marks. Crystal's case reminds us that even in disaster zones, crime does not stop, and sometimes the storm becomes cover for it. By the end of this phase, the evidence spoke louder than the weather. Investigators knew they were not searching for a missing woman. They were building a homicide case. And the next logical step would be to match the physical findings against digital records, to see who Crystal was in contact with before everything went silent. The morgue findings left no room for speculation. Crystal McDowell had been killed by strangulation. For investigators, the next move was to uncover how she moved, who she spoke with, and whether her financial footprint could reveal a suspect. In the 21st century, a homicide investigation is not just about the body. It is about the data surrounding a life. Detectives began by requesting her call detail records from her cell provider. The log showed that Crystal's last outgoing communication occurred the night before her disappearance. By 7:35 a.m., the hour she was last seen on camera leaving her boyfriend's driveway, her phone still registered as active. Within minutes of that departure, her device went silent. No new pings hit the towers around Baytown. For investigators, that was a red flag. Even in areas hit by Harvey, most devices generated at least residual signals. Here, there was nothing. That absence was cataloged as negative evidence. It did not prove who had acted against her, but it proved that her disappearance was not voluntary. People fleeing a hurricane call relatives. They message children. They post online. Crystal's complete digital silence, beginning almost exactly at the time she vanished from sight, gave weight to the homicide ruling from the autopsy. Her email accounts were reviewed with consent orders. There were no unusual communications in the days leading up to her disappearance, only client appointments and real estate correspondence. Investigators highlighted one scheduled meeting for the morning of August 25th that she never attended. It aligned with the family's description of her reliability. She would not miss business commitments without explanation. Financial records told the same story. Crystal's debit and credit cards showed no activity after the evening of August 24th. No gas purchases, no withdrawals, no food or hotel charges. When investigators checked ATM surveillance linked to her account, there were no attempted transactions. The storm might have disrupted normal commerce, but it did not erase financial records. The silence across her accounts mirrored the silence on her phone. At this stage, detectives considered whether someone else could have accessed her accounts. Subpoenas to her bank revealed a suspicious login on a joint account days after her disappearance. While the login itself did not prove direct involvement in the crime, it suggested someone with knowledge of her credentials attempted to access funds while the case was still active. That detail became a marker in the timeline, a point investigators would revisit when narrowing suspects. The combination of digital and financial forensics provided a clean arc. Active communication and financial activity through August 24th. Visual confirmation of departure on August 25th at 7:35 a.m. Complete silence. No calls, no texts, no transactions within minutes after leaving the driveway. For investigators, these lines converged into one conclusion. The crime had occurred almost immediately after she was last seen. Detectives presented their findings in internal briefings. One noted, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. What he meant was that the absence of noise, no false leads, no scattered activity, pointed not to chaos, but to deliberate removal of signals. This raised the possibility that the suspect understood her patterns and knew how to interrupt them. For the family, the silence was devastating. Each new record confirmed what they feared. Crystal had not run from Harvey, and she had not chosen to disappear. Every procedural discovery reinforced the homicide narrative. Still, investigators held back from naming any suspect publicly. The focus remained on building the strongest possible case through evidence, not speculation. As the data accumulated, detectives began charting Crystal's relationships. They knew that digital silence is not just technical, it reflects the social context. Who had access to her phone? Who knew her banking passwords? Who would benefit from controlling her disappearance? The next stage of the investigation would move beyond records and into personal dynamics. The escalation points, the jealousies, and the conflicts that often precede intimate partner homicide. The digital and financial forensics had drawn a hard boundary around the timeline of Crystal McDowell's disappearance. What came next was equally important: understanding her life, her relationships, and the pressure points that might explain how a vibrant 37-year-old mother of two could be targeted so decisively. In any homicide investigation, victimology is not just background. It is a procedural necessity, the blueprint for motive. Crystal lived in Baytown, Texas, a community where refineries and real estate carried equal weight in shaping daily life. She was a licensed realtor, described by colleagues as motivated, professional, and resilient. At the time of her disappearance, she was navigating two challenges at once: the chaos of a looming natural disaster and the more private strain of a divorce that had finalized but left behind unresolved tensions. She had two children with her ex-husband, Stephen McDowell. Their custody arrangement, while legally documented, was a source of recurring conflict. Friends would later tell investigators that Crystal had been upbeat about her future, but frustrated by the emotional volatility surrounding her co-parenting relationship. This was where escalation entered the frame. Detectives began interviewing close contacts, family members, her boyfriend, colleagues, and even clients scheduled to meet her. These interviews painted a consistent picture. Crystal was reliable. She showed up for work, for her children, and for commitments. She had a habit of answering calls immediately, a pattern noted by her aunt who first reported her missing. The abrupt cessation of contact on the morning of August 25th was not just unusual, it was incompatible with her personality. That absence gave weight to the theory of foul play. Investigators also noted a broader pattern found in many intimate partner violence cases. Escalation is rarely sudden. It builds over weeks, months, even years. Crystal's separation from Stephen had marked a turning point. While legally divorced, their relationship did not stabilize. Witness statements indicated frequent disputes about child custody, finances, and Crystal's new relationship. These stressors became important because they aligned with criminological risk factors for domestic homicide: jealousy, perceived loss of control, and the presence of children in a contested custody situation. Law enforcement interviewed Stephen McDowell in the days after Crystal's disappearance. At that point, he was still treated as one of several people close to her life. His statements were noted as cooperative, but investigators documented inconsistencies in timelines and emotional presentation. He claimed not to know where Crystal had gone. He referenced the storm, suggesting she may have left to seek safety. For investigators, this explanation did not align with the evidence. Her phone had gone silent too abruptly, and her car had been abandoned in a flooded area with no sign of voluntary departure. It was here that escalation theory merged with digital data. The absence of activity from Crystal after 7:35 a.m. matched precisely with the time window she was known to be in Stephen's custody for a planned child exchange. Detectives cataloged this overlap carefully, knowing it could form the foundation of a charging theory later. At this stage, though, it remained a procedural note, not a public accusation. Victimology also required attention to Crystal's strengths. She was not described as reckless, nor as someone who engaged in high-risk behaviors. This fact mattered procedurally. It eliminated theories that she had placed herself in jeopardy through criminal association or impulsive decisions. Instead, the investigation narrowed to the realm of domestic escalation, where homicide is most often committed not by strangers, but by partners or former partners. Investigators consulted with the Chambers County District Attorney's Office, comparing Crystal's profile with known case patterns in Texas. Data from statewide crime reports showed that women killed in domestic incidents often vanish during custody exchanges, during arguments over separation, or in the weeks following a new relationship. Crystal's case aligned with all three markers. She had divorced, begun a new relationship, and continued to negotiate custody with an ex-spouse who demonstrated signs of possessiveness. The escalation was not just theoretical, it was evidenced in interviews. Friends recalled Crystal expressing concern about Stephen's anger. She did not describe physical violence in the weeks leading to her disappearance, but she did mention unpredictable moods. Detectives noted this in their logs. Subject expressed anxiety about subject ex-husband's volatility. Though such statements are not determinative, they are classified as working evidence, helping investigators assess risk and motive. Forensic psychology became a subtle layer in this stage of the investigation. Experts consulted by the district attorney's office explained that in domestic homicide cases, escalation often coincides with external stressors. Hurricane Harvey, bearing down on Baytown, provided exactly that context. As thousands prepared for evacuation or shelter, Crystal's disappearance could easily be masked by the storm's chaos. For law enforcement, this realization underscored how deliberate timing might have intersected with opportunity. At the end of these interviews and analyses, the victimology of Crystal McDowell was clear. She was a devoted mother, a professional woman, and a person at low risk for voluntary disappearance. The escalation context pointed inward toward her personal life and specifically toward contested custody and unresolved resentment. This framework would carry investigators into their next step, transforming theory into actionable charging evidence. When investigators finished mapping Crystal McDowell's victimology, they had something critical, a profile that eliminated voluntary disappearance and underscored escalation risk. The next procedural step was transforming these findings into a prosecutorial theory, something a district attorney could carry into court. In a homicide case, charging theory is more than suspicion. It's the bridge between investigative facts and legal accountability. The Chambers County Sheriff's Office began drafting a cohesive narrative from the data points already established. First came the timeline. Crystal was last seen alive the morning of August 25, 2017, preparing for a custody exchange just hours before Hurricane Harvey made landfall. Within minutes of leaving her boyfriend's house, her phone went silent. Within hours, her car was located in a flooded area, empty and abandoned. The working theory was that this was not a disappearance driven by choice, but by intervention. That timeline, matched against custody arrangements, placed her ex-husband Stephen squarely in the window of opportunity. At this stage, however, opportunity was not enough. Prosecutors needed corroborating evidence that could withstand defense scrutiny. Detectives began to compile everything: the digital silence of Crystal's phone, the forensic readouts of cell site locations, and the documented custody schedule. They also logged negative evidence. What was missing? There was no sign Crystal had purchased supplies to evacuate, no note to family, no trail of financial withdrawals. For a woman meticulous in both her professional and personal obligations, that absence was telling. Interagency coordination became a critical factor. Chambers County investigators were working against the backdrop of a natural disaster. Roads were underwater, communication lines strained, and resources were diverted to emergency response. The FBI, already on alert for storm-related crises, was consulted to ensure cell site analysis and digital records were preserved before they could be lost in the storm's chaos. The Department of Public Safety also assisted in aerial surveys, searching for both vehicles and potential remains in flood zones. While these agencies had broader mandates during Harvey, Crystal's case was marked as urgent precisely because domestic homicide can escalate quickly, with risk to surviving family members. In procedural terms, building a charging theory required piecing together evidence categories into a coherent whole. Forensic examiners mapped phone activity against custody exchange times. Detectives corroborated interviews from family and friends, showing that Crystal had no intent to leave town without her children. Financial records confirmed she had made no unusual withdrawals. All of these elements were assembled in the DA's case file as working evidence, not conclusive on their own, but collectively building toward probable cause. Interviews with Stephen McDowell began to show stress points. Detectives noted discrepancies between his accounts and the digital record. He suggested Crystal may have left due to the storm, but her phone data showed the abrupt stop near his residence. These contradictions were not immediately grounds for arrest, but prosecutors saw how they could evolve into leverage under interrogation. The DA's office flagged the inconsistencies, classifying them as preliminary impeachment material for trial. Strategically, investigators also considered the psychology of timing. In domestic homicide cases, arrest too early can weaken prosecutorial posture if the body is not yet recovered. Waiting allows investigators to strengthen forensic links, phone data, autopsy findings, and corroborating witness testimony. Yet waiting too long risks public criticism and loss of control over a volatile suspect. Chambers County had to balance both. Prosecutors coordinated with investigators daily, discussing whether probable cause had ripened enough to file charges. As the body was later recovered, the charging theory solidified. Cause of death was confirmed as strangulation, and this aligned with investigative suspicions from the start. But even before that confirmation, interagency efforts had made clear that Crystal's disappearance was not a product of natural disaster or voluntary absence. The DA's office began drafting potential indictments under Texas Penal Code provisions for homicide, specifically targeting intentional causation of death. This chapter in the case shows how true crime investigations rarely unfold in a straight line. They move through layers of uncertainty, assembling fragments into a prosecutable whole. For viewers, it's a reminder that criminal charges are not built on rumor or suspicion. They are constructed on the framework of admissible evidence, cross-agency coordination, and the systematic elimination of alternative explanations. By the end of this stage, Chambers County had moved beyond missing person status. They were preparing for a homicide indictment, with digital forensics, victimology, and interview inconsistencies forming the backbone of their case. The question now shifted from what happened to Crystal to how will prosecutors prove it in front of a jury. By the time the Chambers County Sheriff's Office and the District Attorney's team had completed their primary investigation, the attention shifted from gathering evidence to assembling it into a case that could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. Investigations are not only about solving a crime, they are about proving it to a standard that leaves no reasonable doubt. In this phase, every fragment of evidence, digital records, forensic analysis, and witness testimony had to be connected into a coherent narrative. Prosecutors reviewed the physical chain of custody documents. The phone records, surveillance data, and financial timelines had already been cataloged. What remained was the task of translating that into a sequence of events that jurors could follow. In crimes of domestic homicide, motive becomes just as crucial as opportunity. Investigators and prosecutors worked together to establish why Crystal McDowell, a mother with no apparent enemies, would become the target of violence so close to home. The trial preparation highlighted one detail: the timing of Crystal's disappearance in relation to Hurricane Harvey. Prosecutors anticipated the defense might argue that the storm created chaos that could obscure alternative explanations for her absence. To counter that, they prepared expert witnesses to testify that the storm's impact had no bearing on her timeline of disappearance. By anchoring Crystal's last known movements firmly in the hours before the hurricane made landfall, they eliminated natural disaster as a cover story. Forensic specialists were placed on the witness list to explain technical findings. Cell site analysis experts would testify about Crystal's phone location data. A forensic pathologist would describe the autopsy results in clinical terms, including the cause of death by strangulation. Crime scene technicians would discuss negative evidence: no signs of forced entry, no indications of a break-in, and no evidence suggesting robbery. Each witness served to narrow the window of explanation, removing speculation until only one plausible scenario remained. At the same time, prosecutors prepared Crystal's friends and family for testimony. They would speak not only about her character but about her state of mind in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The goal was not sentimentality, but establishing context. Their testimony would demonstrate that Crystal had plans, responsibilities, and aspirations, traits inconsistent with voluntary disappearance. An important strategic decision was how to handle the relationship between Crystal and her ex-husband, Stephen McDowell. Prosecutors intended to avoid inflaming the jury with unnecessary drama, but still needed to show the dynamic of control and conflict that had existed. Testimony would be presented about custody arrangements, prior disagreements, and patterns of communication. These were not distractions. They were pieces of motive, carefully structured to show why the crime made sense in the context of domestic history. Jury selection strategy was also a focus. In a county affected by the hurricane, potential jurors were living witnesses to the disaster's aftermath. Prosecutors anticipated that defense attorneys might leverage the chaos of Harvey as a theme. To safeguard against confusion, the state intended to emphasize during voir dire that while storms disrupt lives, they do not erase the forensic record left behind in a violent crime. Internally, investigators noted the fragility of some evidence. Digital timelines depended heavily on consistency of service providers, and there were minor gaps caused by storm-related outages. Prosecutors prepared to acknowledge those gaps honestly, framing them as expected anomalies during Harvey rather than weaknesses that undermined the core of the case. As one investigator observed in post-case notes, it wasn't the gaps that mattered, it was the continuity before and after those gaps that told the story. The community's interest in the trial also mattered. In towns across Texas, domestic homicides often bring forward a secondary question: how can patterns of coercion and abuse be recognized earlier? Prosecutors knew the jury would hear Crystal's story as more than just one incident. It reflected a broader crisis of intimate partner violence. Without overstating, they integrated that awareness into their preparation. The narrative they sought to present was factual, but it carried an implicit reminder. Silence and control behind closed doors can escalate to lethal outcomes. By the time opening statements were drafted, the case file was more than evidence. It was an organized narrative. Investigators had moved from searching for Crystal to explaining her final hours with precision. Prosecutors had moved from suspicion to establishing proof. And the community, once left with only questions, was about to hear how the pieces fit together. The next step would be to bring those pieces before a jury and subject them to the adversarial process. For investigators, it was the moment when months of detail-oriented work would be tested in public. For Crystal's family, it was the moment when grief had to coexist with the pursuit of justice. When the trial opened in Chambers County, the weight of 2 years of investigative labor was finally placed before a jury. Trials in domestic homicide cases rarely revolve around shocking new revelations. Instead, they are battles over interpretation, whether the chain of evidence holds firm, whether motive is compelling, and whether doubt can be manufactured by the defense. In this courtroom, every piece of the Crystal McDowell investigation would be tested in public view. The prosecution began with structure. Their opening statement was not emotional, it was chronological. They guided the jury through Crystal's last known morning, her absence during Hurricane Harvey's landfall, and the forensic reconstruction that followed. The jury was told they would see call logs, hear from cell-site experts, and listen to the medical examiner's report. In a trial like this, clarity mattered more than drama. The first witnesses were law enforcement officers. Detectives described the timeline of the missing persons report, the early search efforts, and the initial interviews. Their testimony served to anchor the jury. This was not a sudden assumption of foul play, but a structured escalation from concern to criminal investigation. Each officer emphasized that no evidence supported voluntary disappearance. Crystal's car was located, but her phone activity ceased. Preliminary checks showed no travel, no communication, no digital footprint after that morning. For jurors, it framed the narrative. Absence was not choice, it was interruption. Next came the forensic experts. A pathologist detailed the autopsy findings. Strangulation as the cause of death was presented clinically, with diagrams and measured language. Jurors were told there were no defensive wounds consistent with an attack by an unknown intruder. Instead, the pattern fit close contact violence, deliberate and sustained. The forensic testimony eliminated alternative explanations. It was not accident, not misadventure, not disappearance in a storm. It was homicide. Digital evidence followed. A cell site analyst demonstrated how Crystal's phone registered its final movements. Even with the disruptions of Harvey, the continuity of data showed her device ceased activity in a narrow window. Jurors saw charts that placed her within known geographic ranges, all consistent with the prosecution's theory. A second expert explained the absence of further communication. No outgoing texts, no calls, no account activity. That silence, they argued, was the digital fingerprint of death. The defense cross-examined these witnesses carefully. They pressed the pathologist on the possibility of misinterpretation. They suggested that storm-related outages could distort digital timelines. They asked whether the absence of forced entry truly eliminated other suspects. The prosecution had anticipated each challenge. The experts calmly explained that gaps in service were normal during Harvey, but the key was continuity before and after outages. Absence of forced entry did not prove innocence. It merely showed familiarity. And the medical examiner confirmed that cause of death had been determined with confidence. Family witnesses were called. Crystal's relatives spoke about her role as a mother and her plans in the days before she vanished. Their testimony was restrained but powerful, illustrating that she had commitments she would not abandon voluntarily. Friends testified about her character, about strained dynamics with her ex-husband, and about the absence of any indication she would leave her children behind. The jury heard the human side, but it was still tied tightly to the evidentiary framework. When the prosecution introduced statements from Stephen McDowell himself, the tone shifted. Jurors were told about his interviews with investigators. Inconsistencies were highlighted, how his description of Crystal's last visit conflicted with digital records, how his demeanor shifted under questioning. Prosecutors reminded jurors that lies, even small ones, are significant when a person's freedom is at stake. They played clips from interviews, letting jurors hear hesitation and deflection for themselves. The defense attempted to create shadows of doubt. They raised the hurricane again, arguing that its chaos complicated every timeline. They suggested that grief and stress could explain Stephen's inconsistencies. They implied that the state was too quick to focus on one man rather than consider other possibilities. But the cumulative weight of evidence made those arguments fragile. Every doubt they suggested had already been addressed by data, by science, by the steady testimony of experts. Inside the courtroom, Crystal's family listened quietly. For them, this was not a forensic exercise, but a replay of loss. For the investigators, it was the point where years of disciplined work were measured against defense strategy. And for the jury, it was the moment to reconcile evidence with judgment. The trial phase showed what makes true crime cases resonate, not theatrics, but the balance of proof. When physical evidence, digital logs, and human testimony converge, the story becomes difficult to refute. Prosecutors were careful not to overreach, presenting their case step by step. Each witness added a layer. Each exhibit closed another door on alternative explanations. By the time closing arguments approached, the jury had heard from every major participant: law enforcement, forensic experts, friends, family, and the accused himself. The question was not whether Crystal McDowell died by violence. The question was who committed the act and whether the state had proved it beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial was nearly complete, but one chapter remained. The verdict. The courtroom in Chambers County was silent as the jury filed back in. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and evidence review, the trial of Stephen McDowell reached its conclusion. Crystal's family sat in the front rows, her children too young to understand the magnitude of the moment, shielded by relatives who carried the weight of their mother's absence. On the opposite side, Stephen sat with his attorneys, expression fixed, waiting for the words that would determine the rest of his life. The prosecutor had built the case brick by brick. Cell phone data placing Stephen with Crystal, conflicting statements about his whereabouts, and ultimately, his own admissions of strangling her during a confrontation. It was not one piece of evidence, but the convergence of many: the digital trail, the inconsistencies in his interviews, and the grim recovery of Crystal's body. Together, they left no space for reasonable doubt. When the foreperson rose, the words were short but final: guilty. The courtroom exhaled. Crystal's family held each other tightly, tears breaking through the composure they had held for nearly 2 years. For them, it was not victory, because no sentence could bring Crystal back. But it was accountability, something that mattered when so much had been stolen. The judge, after considering the severity of the act and its impact on the surviving children, imposed a sentence of 50 years in prison. Stephen McDowell would spend the majority of his remaining life behind bars. The sentence carried weight not only for its length, but for what it symbolized: society's unequivocal rejection of domestic violence disguised as private conflict. The court made clear that Crystal's life mattered, that her death was not just a statistic overshadowed by Hurricane Harvey, but a crime that demanded justice. As the gavel fell, the case shifted from trial evidence to aftermath. Crystal's children, now growing up without their mother, became the focus of extended family who stepped in to provide stability. In Baytown, the story resonated deeply. Residents remembered the chaos of Harvey, the floodwaters that swallowed neighborhoods, and how, in the middle of that disaster, another tragedy unfolded in silence. The hurricane had destroyed homes, but Crystal's murder reminded everyone that the most dangerous storms can begin inside the walls of a house. Prosecutors later reflected that domestic homicides are among the hardest to prevent because they often hide behind closed doors. Friends and neighbors may see tension, may even sense fear, but rarely imagine that it will escalate to murder. Crystal's case became a cautionary reminder. Early intervention, awareness, and accountability are not luxuries, they are lifelines. In reporting the verdict, local news did not dwell on sensationalism. They highlighted Crystal's role as a mother, her career as a realtor, and the fact that she had been trying to build a future even as she navigated the complications of a divorce. To them, she was not defined by the violence that ended her life, but by the contributions she made while living it. For investigators, the trial closed the file, but not without reflection. They acknowledged how quickly the case might have slipped away in the chaos of a natural disaster. Had Crystal's disappearance been attributed solely to the hurricane, her killer might never have faced justice. It was persistence, tracking the data, pressing through false leads, and refusing to dismiss anomalies that carried the case forward. As the years passed, the sentence stood firm. Appeals did not overturn it. Stephen remained in custody, while Crystal's absence continued to echo through every milestone her children reached. Birthdays, graduations, ordinary moments, her seat was always empty. Family members spoke publicly at times, urging others to pay attention to warning signs in relationships, stressing that silence can be deadly. The final reflection of this case is not only about one crime, but about its larger meaning. Domestic violence is not confined to a type of family, neighborhood, or community. It thrives where shame and silence allow it to. Crystal's story, though tragic, underscores the importance of breaking that silence before it hardens into irreversible loss. In the end, Crystal McDowell's life was cut short by violence at the hands of someone who once vowed to care for her. Stephen McDowell was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The case remains a stark reminder. Behind many closed doors, danger waits unseen, and when it erupts, it is not just a family matter, it is a crime. As I close this story, I can't help but think of how fragile life is, and how quickly trust can turn into tragedy. Crystal's case is not just about one family. It's about the hidden dangers that can exist behind closed doors. If there's one lesson here, it's that silence allows violence to grow. We all have the power to speak up, to look out for each other, and to refuse to let abuse go unseen. What about you? Have you ever noticed red flags in a relationship and wondered what you would do? I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, share where you're watching from or tell me what part struck you most. And if you found value in this case, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next true crime story that might change the way we see justice, safety, and the strength of community.